Have you ever thought about this? What if the water you drink was actually listening? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, yeah, pretty controversial idea. The claim that our words, our thoughts, and even our feelings can leave a physical, measurable message on water itself. I mean, really think about that for a second. We talk all the time about the power of positive thinking, right? But what if that power was something you could actually see? What if your intentions could leave a visible mark on the most essential element for life on Earth? Okay, just look at this. On the left, you see this absolutely gorgeous, perfectly symmetrical ice crystal. That came from water that was exposed to the words, "thank you." And on the right, a chaotic, shattered mess. That's from water that heard, "you fool." It's night and day, right? This is the exact visual that kicked off a massive global debate. So the person behind all this was a Japanese researcher named Dr. Masaru Emoto. His core idea was, well, it was revolutionary. He basically claimed that water acts like a mirror to our consciousness. He believed our thoughts, the words we use, even the music we listen to, could physically change how water molecules get themselves organized. So, the big question is, how on earth did he capture these incredible, wildly different images? The process, on the surface, seems pretty straightforward. But, as we're about to see, the implications of what he was doing are huge and also deeply controversial. So here's how it worked. He'd start by taking different samples of water. Then, he'd expose them to all sorts of things. Maybe he'd tape a word to the outside of a jar or play music next to it. After that, he'd flash freeze the samples to a chilly -25 degrees Celsius. And then, using a high-powered microscope, he'd photograph the ice crystals that formed. Or, in some cases, the total lack of crystals. And it wasn't just about words. He did the same thing with music. Water that listened to classical stuff, Beethoven or Mozart, supposedly formed these beautiful, well-ordered crystals. But then, water that got a dose of heavy metal music, well, that resulted in fragmented, chaotic, and just kind of broken patterns. So what did Dr. Emoto make of all this? He believed his results showed that water has a kind of memory. He thought it could literally absorb and hold onto the energy from its surroundings, whether that's from words, music, or our emotions, and then reflect that energy in its actual physical structure. Now, as you can probably guess, these are some pretty extraordinary claims, and they were met with a huge wave of skepticism from the scientific community. This is where those beautiful images collide with the cold, hard reality of scientific investigation. So you have Emoto's interpretation on one side, and on the other, you have this wall of scientific criticism. Skeptics are quick to point out his experiments were never published in any major peer-reviewed journals, and that other labs found it nearly impossible to get the same results consistently. They also point to a lack of rigorous controls. For a good experiment, you'd want it to be double-blind, meaning the person taking the photos has no idea which sample is which. This prevents something called confirmation bias, where you might subconsciously pick the pictures that best fit your theory. This kind of debate has happened before in science. It actually reminds me a lot of a famous case back in the 60s involving something called polywater. For a while, scientists were convinced they'd discovered this revolutionary, new, dense form of water. It was a huge deal, until it was eventually debunked. Turned out it was just regular water with some tiny impurities in it. The whole polywater story is this perfect reminder of how the scientific method is supposed to work. You've heard the saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And even the most exciting, coolest-sounding ideas have to stand up to some really tough testing before they can be accepted as fact. But here's the thing. Whether the scientific community signed off on it or not, Emoto's idea just took off. It developed a life of its own, spreading through popular culture and inspiring all kinds of other simpler experiments that people could try at home. Maybe the most famous of these is the rice experiment. You might have even seen this one online. People would put cooked rice and water into 2 jars. They'd label one, love or thank you, and the other, hate or you're an idiot. And thousands of people who tried this reported the exact same thing. The love rice stayed perfectly white, while the hate rice quickly turned into this dark, nasty-looking mold. Now, what's really interesting is that those beautiful, positive crystals from Emoto's photos have a deep connection to a totally real, verified scientific concept: fractals. Fractals are these infinitely repeating geometric patterns that you see absolutely everywhere in nature, from a tiny snowflake to the veins in a leaf to the branches of a tree. A physicist named Richard Taylor actually studied how our brains react to these patterns, and what he found is pretty amazing. He discovered our brains are literally hardwired to process fractals easily and to find them beautiful. He calls this fractal fluency. It seems we find them calming and pleasing, probably because for thousands of years, recognizing these patterns in nature meant finding food, water, and safety.
And you can actually measure this effect. Get this. Taylor's research, where he monitored people's brain activity, found that just looking at these natural fractal patterns can cause a physiological stress reduction of up to 60%. That's huge.
So, okay, even if the science behind Emoto's water crystals is up for debate, the science behind why we love looking at fractal patterns is rock solid. And that kind of brings us to the real heart of the matter. Why do we find these ideas so powerful? Why do they resonate with us so much? Well, maybe the biggest reason this idea hits home is this simple fact. Our own bodies are about 60% water. So when someone suggests our words can change water, it's not just about a glass on a table anymore. It suddenly becomes deeply personal. It implies that every single word we speak, every intention we have, is also a message we're sending directly to ourselves. And that's why, in the end, a lot of people embrace Emoto's work not necessarily as hard science, but as a really powerful visual metaphor. It's this compelling, beautiful reminder of how important positive self-talk is, the power of gratitude, and just being mindful of the kind of energy we put out into the world and towards each other. So we're left at this really fascinating crossroads. Is this a real, physical phenomenon that science just hasn't figured out how to measure yet? Or is it a beautiful, powerful metaphor for the impact our intentions have on our lives? In the end, maybe the most important question isn't whether our words change water, but how we already know for a fact that they change each other.